Greetings, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway. And on top of that, because of the day, the time of year is important for this, there might be fireworks in the background, even though it is daytime, simply because in the city in which I live, November 30 to December 1st, there's a transition marked by a tremendous number of fireworks at midnight. And all through the day before, and then leading into the day after, you might still hear people setting things off. So it's always fun to see what will end up on the final recording. Who knows? Today, for those who can see the screen, we are going to be looking at Clarkesworld, the October issue. And just like the Asimov's issue that we did last time, there is definitely something a little bit spookier to this one, but with some highly amusing back-end or background commentary that I should add to flesh out how interesting some of these stories are in relation to the fact that every publication has its aesthetic framework and its limitations in terms of what it does not want and what it will not accept. And Neil is adamant about not accepting zombie stories. Nonetheless, death features highly in these pieces. Not all of them, but there are many different ways in which a person can become occupied or by something else, or exist in some kind of death state. And none of these stories are zombie stories. So there's actually something quite clever that's been done here in terms of illustrating that there is a framework of what is acceptable, but no zombies. No zombies. There's also another important context that I'd like to highlight with respect to the length of these stories. I don't usually go into the differences too much, but we have to remember again, this is still a material industry. These are products. When a story is sold, the author is paid by word the vast majority of the time, and that means that there's a budget for every issue that needs to be taken under consideration. One piece in this issue is 25,000 words, more or less. That's huge. That's a novella. That's a honkin' big novella. As a result, most of the other stories are quite small. That doesn't mean they don't pack a punch, but you can see sometimes by looking at the give and take, the balance on the page, the kind of production details that need to be taken into consideration and are often forgotten, especially when it comes to digital media, because when you see an actual tangible material magazine issue, it's easy to tell, yes, there are printing costs associated with this. We sometimes forget that there are absolutely costs associated with the presence of these stories online, and Neil especially has been working to try to create a model that will be able to emulate some of what a few rare print publications have been able to do in terms of funding the staff as well. That doesn't right now go into the equation, but he's working toward that end, and he's always working on advocacy to make sure that people realize these are, even though they're online, material objects. This is an important consideration because a lot of what we're dealing with in our culture is based on a lack of connection to the ways in which things are made. And so we don't fully grasp, most of us, how much cloud computing, for instance, is an incredibly important part of our workflow. AI processes, so-called generative AI processes, also have material locations, data centers that have an impact on their surrounding ecosystem. But often what we do online just has almost a magical disembodied flavor to it, and this can be difficult for us when we're trying to come up with more ethical systems for ourselves and for our communities, when we're trying to think of how to navigate the world ahead. We've been so consumed in this digital realm that we do often forget it has material properties, and we need to be thinking carefully about their economies as we try to fix problems with climate change, ongoing, in terms of mitigating climate change more than anything, and also trying to keep it tempered as much as we can. And also with other material use cases, our energy grid, for instance, how much our growth-oriented economy is actually yielding effective outcomes for everyone in it, We just need to stop thinking about the digital realm as abstractly as we have been. So this was a good opportunity to call attention to that before we hop into the stories themselves. And of course, there's the stories, then we'll get into the nonfiction after. But I like to start with the cover art. Now, I do this, as I've mentioned, in part because not everybody who enjoys Clarkesworld is going to be able to see the cover. There are blind and low vision readers of the publication, and yet there's something wonderful about the aesthetic of a good cover in terms of setting the stage for what comes next. As I've mentioned, Clarkesworld really tends to choose covers that I feel check off the big three boxes in terms of the tension that you find in a lot of science fiction between the human, nature in a broader sense, and sort of mechanical or artificial nature. And in this cover here, we have those items. Again, I do have all of the names listed in a document to help with this. This is Rim World Flyer by Robert Watts. And it's a very muted cover in many ways. The colors don't really pop here, which allows it to feel a little bit more classic. It has a classic feel, like a lot of cover art one would imagine from a different decade. In this piece, we've got some very muted sort of sepia yellow and faded green tones, dark shadows as well. And what we are supposed to be paying attention to in this image is this vessel that is taking flight, but because it's at a canted angle, there is a sense of vulnerability to it. It is a wobbly construction. It is this round mechanical object with fairly fragile wings, and it's hovering just a little bit over the water. The sky has this tension between, is the sky of a world or is it a vista of a whole nebula? It has that deeper cosmic feel to it. But ultimately, that object is a really good choice for this cover because the way that the ship is designed should hopefully inspire thoughts of many insects in our world that look like they maybe shouldn't be able to take flight and yet do. So nature crafts some really interesting solutions to these problems, and we do as well when in fumbling ways we try to emulate that design. So we have this ship setting off in a fragile way, that tenuous line between nature and its fragility, humanity as a part of nature and its fragility in its design of artificial forms. Really lovely, and I think as we go through some of these pieces, you'll feel that same thematic through line in many of them. We are going to start with Abby Nicole Yee's A Space Opera. Now, I say a space opera, it is spelled a little bit differently. It's a space O/pera, but I think I'm doing it justice by saying it that way. This story is interesting for me because it tweaks in certain ways and then requires me as the reader to pay attention to other elements instead. When I say it tweaks, it's doing something that's always a little bit delicate. It's setting its storyline in a nearish future, the 2090s, and yet it's trying to comment really on something in the present. And when you set something in the, say, 2090s, there can be little details that the reader might trip over in terms of thinking, well, is that really going to be as important a consideration at that time? Is that more of a concern for today? For instance, there's one price point for something, 2.1 million, and I'm thinking with the inflation, would that actually be as staggering a sum in 2090s? It's debatable. The point is, it's a delicate framework in terms of setting, because if it's super near future, you can definitely have a lot of challenges and problems. But at that point, the near to mid future, there are so many things that could have happened to change our society. Just looking back the last 50 to 60 years as well for reflection, or 70 years for reflection, and sometimes it's really hard to emulate. The other component that I tripped over a little bit as I was reading this story is the central premise involves a space flight that the Philippines is is in the process of doing that involves sending a dog into space. And it's a device used here to highlight the idea of the Philippines coming into its own, doing what had already been done in other parts of the world, the USSR and the United States during their own testing phases with animals. But that, of course, raises the question, why would it need necessarily to be done again in the same way? Then there's the question of whether there'd be the funding for that kind of space agency. A lot of these things can trip over a reader, and you can get caught up in those very fiddly little details. Or, and I recommend this as a reading strategy in general, is pay attention to why the author is making those choices. Why are they choosing to focus on certain things? So for me, I couldn't engage on the story necessarily on a purely realistic level, but when I started to see it as doing really important thematic work instead, then I could just sit back and enjoy. And the piece is reflecting especially on a political context that exists now, that has existed in the Philippines for the last few generations, a sort of relentless authoritarian presence that hoards all the wealth and oppresses and uses state control of media to set certain standards for what everyone else is going to accept as truth, and the struggle to try to carve out some level of resistance and build agency for oneself and one's people in the middle of that. And that's ultimately what this story is doing. So again, when I say that I trip over something, I'm not trying to say that it is bad or wrong, but I'm suggesting that there are reading strategies that work better with works like this. And I truly love to ask myself, okay, why has the author made these choices? What is the author's priority in writing the work that they have? Because you can tear stories apart with little tiny details or questions of the level of verisimilitude as it's being presented, or you can really give yourself an opportunity to see the world through a slightly different lens. And this one, even though it's about the Philippines and it resonates strongly with Filipino history in relation to authoritarian government and corruption therein, there are overlapping lessons that I think will be quite useful to worldly readers. So don't let yourself get hung up on specific details when reading this, and more think about the overall experience and what it's trying to convey by using some adjacent elements of other space agency histories to tell a story about injustice here. Okay, now that was a long beginning. The next piece by Nigel Brown is The Buried People. And like I said, there are so many ways in which a kind of death happens in this work, but it's not zombies. And I think there's something very wisely done by Neil in this regard. It's an October issue, so you do get some spooky flavor in some of these pieces. The Buried People has us following Allison, who is a shepherd living in the Caledonian Highlands in a future, some kind of post-apocalyptic landscape in which we've lost a tremendous amount of knowledge and we're just trying to get by. But certain parts of the world, of course, were better studies at regaining tech and learning to exploit other people with that tech. And so right now we have Allison helping an expedition involving two other core characters, Phillips and Minion. And the former is helping the latter to find and collect a type of genetically modified human that buries itself in the landscape to survive cold periods. And there's some interesting commentary about how little adjustments might have been made to create this other people, this more resilient people. And they have their different reasons for doing things. Phillips is a little bit more pragmatic, but ultimately Minion is someone who is planning simply to exploit these people, collect them, cage them, take them off, and use them as labor. And yet, there's not too much that can be done about that bigger movement in the world, the exploitation that happens all around them. So Allison, in this story, just has to find a way to navigate the difficult situation she finds herself in as she is helping this group and realizing what they are doing. And there's another character that comes in later in the story, so I'm not going to mention it now so you can have the reading experience. but it does speak to the fact that technology and advancement is all in the eye of the beholder, and so the buried people in some ways might be seen as much more resilient, but every generation is going to have its different adaptive flavor, and just because they have been able to survive certain changes in the overall ecosystem does not mean that they can't fall prey to tremendously abusive human forces. So there's some interesting nuance in the world building there. The next one, Fiona Moore's The Children of Flame, also deals with a sort of future context in which things have fallen apart and people have tried to find different ways to rebuild. So these two stories are wonderful to read in contrast or in connection with one another. The key component here, I won't get too much into all of the details with the little groups, because the bigger component is that there are a bundle of disparate peoples with different belief sets and different approaches to society that are living more or less in harmony with one another, despite the fact that they have many differences. Our protagonist is somebody who has tried to improve agency, improve freedom of choice for every sentient they've come across. And yet, again, just as in the last story, there's one group that is also trying to exploit everyone else. So the feudalists are coming by and insisting, look at your feeble, fragile ways. You could have so much if you were to join this broader community. You would be well taken care of. But of course, it's at loss to individuality, to a lot of freedom of movement and choice. And so the real question built into this interesting far-flung future is whether a society that values its independence and agency and its ability to hold in fragile harmony a variety of different groups can in fact come together well enough to push back on one monolithic force that wants to take away their agency entirely. And that's the question on which this piece hangs, with a fairly optimistic ending, but gently and subtly done. Very important kind of story, I think, to be reading now. The October issue was, of course, before a huge change in circumstance in the U.S. in November especially, but it has that gentle message that I think a lot of people need to hear. It is possible for many disparate groups to find some common cause. Whether they do so, well, it's up to those groups in that moment. But this story does show that there are ways. The next piece is Arula Ratnakar's Fractal Karma, and this is the one I mentioned, the novella, the 25,000 word piece. It earns its word count. Like Ratnakar's writing in general, it is a patient piece. It builds to a very clear understanding of some deep maths and sciences, and it does so in a way that's very accessible. There's a Neil Stephenson-esque quality to the writing always. You're going to find more exposition in the dialogue than you normally would see in Western science fiction and fantasy. And yet, especially in recent pieces, Ratnakar's gotten very good at being able to deftly interweave this with strong character moments and the flavor of everyday discourse. So she's definitely growing into a phenomenal sense of comfort with that brand of storytelling that sometimes some people would say would be info dumping, but here it is setting up pieces for something that will pay off. She manages to take concepts that might be a little bit difficult for some people to grasp and present them in a way, piece by piece, that makes some part of them accessible. And when I say some part of them, I mean the part that shows the relevance of this work. Often mathematics and science, when talked about in the abstract, can be difficult for an everyday person to see how it connects with everyday reality. And yet there's always this binding thread to the choices she's making with those concepts. And here that's very true. She's looking at attractors in math, and she's looking at attractors in real life, in our existence. We humans tend not to think of our recursions as quite as elegant. And maybe they aren't. Maybe it's a lot messier when we have these moments where we flip back to the past or can't quite get out of it. We have in this story a mess of a character. Leela is just somebody who has caused harm in the past, and because she's never fully reckoned with that harm. She isn't really able to make better choices for herself or those around her. She's just impulsively moving from one choice to another, grasping at connection and justifying a lot of harm that she does to other people in service to this vague notion of doing good in the long run. Leela, because she's such a mess of a character, as somebody who can't fully hold on to a job but always has drug dealing to fall back on, and a friend base that is trying to be supportive of her, ends up in a study that has a mysterious government feel to it. Only really military figures and a few high-level mathematicians get into this program, or psychedelics. No, there's no psychedelics researcher specifically in the program. She pretends that she's the psychedelics researcher. She's doing this to get money. She needs to be able to pay rent and prove herself to somebody that she cares for. But after tumbling into this situation, we then get to see through her some beautiful intersections of mathematical theory and some discussions on consciousness as they relate to a very concrete notion of self that I think we can all connect to or relate to in some way. We all know somebody like this, or we've had a moment in our life when we've at least feared that we've been a little bit like the protagonist. So this is what Ratnakar does so well with her writing, is that she's deeply enthusiastic about science literacy and science education and using science fiction to achieve those ends. And the way that she does it is by humanizing the science and humanizing the mathematics. So it is a fun, engaging read that requires your patience, in as much as you should know that as you go through it and as you pick up bits of the mathematical concepts in the beginning, it's not just pure info dumping. It is setting up pieces for a very satisfying conclusion. So this one comes with a high recommendation. I think that Fractal Karma, under other circumstances, could easily have been a published standalone product, the same way that a lot of other novellas have been gifted with that treatment. And if they are gifted with that treatment, they tend to get recognized more for awards. But Fractal Karma is definitely going to be on my novella nominations list for the Nebulas next year. And so no pressure. I'm not going to put that on any of you, but it's just lovely to see really high quality novella work. In our moment, we have a lot of people writing well in this form, but not everybody gets the same level of recognition simply because some of those novellas end up in magazines, whereas other ones are standalone products. And yet the quality is the same, if not better sometimes, in the magazines. So our next piece is Lewis Inglis Hall's Fishing the Intergalactic Stream. It's lightly developed in some ways, but it allows this piece to become a much more atmospheric or tonal work, and I think that's the best way to engage with it. We have a kind of sports fisherman who travels to different worlds and engages in the game of the hunt on each of them, so we get little snippets here and there of how that game of fishing on other worlds plays out. There is something that almost feels as though it's been inspired by video games as well, even though it is definitely set in outer space. There's a feeling to the way that fishing is talked about here that just put me in the mind of certain video game experiences. Whether that was intentional or not is entirely irrelevant. It's just, it has a strong atmosphere that is more important than the particulars of the world, the location that is actually used. There is one location that matters here. One of the worlds, Nero, is a place where a protagonist stays at Pendragon House, trying to fish the same way that he's fished in other spaces. And yet here he is met with a different challenge. He starts to realize that he might be the one who is being lured into something. And we will find out what over the course of the piece. But it's, again, fairly light in certain ways. It has more of a quality of suspense to it. It's not quite a haunted work, but there is something just a little bit beneath the surface that adds an uncanny feel to everything that we are reading. It's both something that you can pin down and something that's meant to be much more abstract about the game, the hunter, and the hunted, and what that might mean as it plays out across the system. The next piece, Mike Robinson's Midnight Patron, again deals with death in a way that is not zombie, but also a little bit like Lewis Inglis Hall's piece, is much more abstracted on purpose. So these two stories are also really good ones to read together because they are much more atmospheric. Here we follow the crow. I think definitely a crow. I think it's maybe a slightly more advanced version of the sentience that we have here. The crow has another member in their society of importance, Tree Talon, but in this moment they've discovered something. The crow has found this very strange space with all these bodies, and one body that's not quite like the others. That's something a little bit more, we're never fully sure what exactly it is, but it has potential to it. And there are also these strange images, these strange visions in this space. So what we are essentially seeing in this story is a character with a different kind of sentience, and a group sentience as well as personal sentience, the same way that we can sometimes share things with our communities and become a little bit more hyper aware because of that. The crow initially tries to rebuild or build upon the fascinating feel that he's getting from this space, that there's something powerful that can be constructed or built upon from the remnants of these people, and the project grows to include the whole group by the end. There is a feeling almost of Frankensteinian creation to this story, but it's more again of a vibe. It's more of a feeling. It's more just a holding intention, that potential, just as with the last. So these two have a kind of nice spooky feel to them without having any of the traditional marks of Halloween tropes. They just are a little bit uncanny, and they work because of that. The next piece is Damián Neri's The Face of God, a documentary. And this one had a little bit of a reading challenge in a different way. The same way that I mentioned that the first piece tweaked me because I had some immediate contentions with the setting, or more to the point, the time period. This piece is unfortunately haunted by something within Western culture that the author might not have been aware of, and so I couldn't help when reading it thinking about the other really good example of a giant floating body above the earth, which came from an episode of Rick and Morty, an early episode of Rick and Morty. Here, this giant form, which is humanoid but not just human, having many other components as well, is meant to be seen with a lot more dread, awe, and wonder of a spiritual dimension. So it's the face of God. The idea is that we are talking to individuals who see this massive object coming to crash into the earth from deep space, with a fairly clear body to it, a form to it, as a god, as a divine force. And so we get reactions from individuals who are seeing it that way. So again, reading a story really requires you to make a choice. Are you going to read only that which affirms and fits perfectly into your own expectations, or are you going to allow that, the writer is going to have their own reasons for doing something and try to figure out what those are, really embrace the world that they have laid out? There's no right or wrong way. People will read as they will, but it is interesting how much the experience changes. Reading Neri's piece was a little bit difficult just because I had that strong background image and I kept thinking of Rick and Morty while I was reading it, but unto itself, it is trying to describe a moment of awe at something colossal, at something strange, something incredibly new, suddenly changing people's expectations of or understanding of past lore, and there's a beauty in that meditation too. So it makes sense that the nonfiction would also have an undead quality to it, again without being zombie, and that is given to us by Octavia Cade in an essay titled Fact, Fiction, and Feeling, Ecological Grief in a Changing World. And this is a meditation on the many forms that this ecological grief can take. It's much more nuanced than simply saying that ecological grief exists. It's looking, when it talks about the actual material realities of ecological change, how different formations of ecological change can bring out that kind of grief work in us. And it talks as well about how science fiction has negotiated some of this as well. So it's a really good, thoughtful look, as these essays always are, at the many different ways that one can have that conversation in prose, and it provides some wonderful concrete material touchstones for authors trying to figure out exactly the flavor they want in their work. I always recommend these essays to authors who are either looking for inspiration for the next story or maybe trying to flesh out their vocabulary for a story in process that isn't quite working the way that they had hoped it might. Our next pieces are 2 interviews, as always, by Arley Sorg with writers who have work forthcoming or just out. Our first interview is titled Moving Further Out into Space and Time, a conversation with Indrapramit Das, and it's set around the publication of the anthology Deep Dream, Science Fiction Exploring the Future of Art, which has a lot of wonderful, chewy, challenging essays unto itself. We won't get into all of them. He talks about a few of them, but Das is very good at not trying to pin down a clear sense of what is art in the context of these investigations. It's really quite a challenging space on purpose. It is a higher level read and highly recommended as well, again, for essays that inspire. But in this piece, he talks with Sorg about some of his background for this, what brought him to anthology work after a career of many other kinds of writing himself, as well as exploring what it is exactly about the concept of art, visual art specifically, that resonated enough to want to put together an anthology on this theme. So it's a chewy conversation that at the same time invites reading an anthology that just has a lot of wonderful, interesting, challenging work to it. So that one's highly recommended. And the next piece is coming in the wake of the publication of The Night Ward, and so it is fittingly titled Unfolding the Full Story, a conversation with R.S.A. Garcia, the author. And it goes into, as Sorg always does, the author's history, bringing them to this work. And in this particular case, Garcia has gone through so many different phases of publication to be able to get to the point where she's putting out this first of 2 volumes that is an extension especially of a lot of work that we have seen in Clarkesworld. What an interview like this does really well is showing that as we go through our careers, trying things one way, then another, we often find that certain stories come back to us, or they take different forms, or they're always operating in lockstep with the work that we might be known for more publicly. So this piece had been building for quite some time, and you get a really good sense of the author's journey in the disclosures that Garcia gives us about the process that led to the construction of this piece. Again, an excellent interview, as Sorg's pieces always are, in aggregate, because through these interviews you get a good grounded sense of how challenging and how complex the history of any given writer in the genre is, and always will be. That's part of the joy of reading the work of other people, is that you get the full benefit of each author's distinct path that brought them to that particular tale at that time. And that brings us to Neil's editorial, which is not spooky for the occasion. October is always a mark of another year of survival for a publication that has gone through so many scraps and worked so hard to continue to grow and try to become a more fully global port of call for science fiction. And so this piece is a reflection on some of the challenges, not just caused by Amazon, but also the whole ChatGPT scare, with respect to being able to focus on improving international submissions numbers. The spam issue definitely seemed to discourage a lot of international submissions for a while, because the news of the publication being able to find a way around that issue didn't travel quite as well or as far as the initial shock of this major publication suddenly becoming inundated by spam. So this piece is really about the next year's goal and the ongoing goal for the organization with respect to being as internationally focused as possible without doing token issues, and through the use of whatever adaptive technologies are necessary to allow for more work in translation as well. So again, ambitious as always, and a reason that I always like to come back to this publication. I I do have a clear favorite, obviously, in this issue, because Fractal Karma is just an elegant read, really well put together, invoking a lot of classic science fiction in its pacing and its suspense and its respect for the science behind a lot of what it is imagining, while also making sure that the science is tied in well to the human. And yet, all throughout this piece, you have some really clever plays on notions of self in relation to community, as always. And the result is an issue with a lot of wonderful pieces to read together in pairs or groupings to really reflect on a tone or a concept in relation to something larger than itself, which, now that I'm saying this, makes me realize, oh wait, that also ties in really well to Fractal Karma too, because one of the main components of the mysterious project is the linking of minds and being able to hold oneself in tension with other selves. And that brings us to the end of this episode. We will be catching up on another Clarkesworld soon, and hopefully also getting to some novel-length fiction that I've wanted to talk about for a little while. But for now, wherever you are, whatever you're reading, just remember to support the work that you love. It's really important to remember the material nature of everything that we are consuming, and to think about that materiality when we're trying to manage bigger problems with our culture as well. So in some ways, science fiction is a microcosm that reflects on a larger state of affairs that needs our attention, and as a result, it is very easy to do science fiction, to read it, to write it, to be a part of it in a way that only amplifies or improves our general praxis as human beings trying to manage and respond to the problems of our day. As always, liking and subscribing can help with the algorithms, which improves my ability as a creator to do more of this work. But either way, I just wish you the very best of reading experiences, writing experiences, and engagement in our difficult world. Hope you have yourselves a terrific day. See you next time.